She was 19 years old, and, by the cold measure of the world, without a roof, without a name that opened doors, without a soul left living who owed her anything at all. She had no family left, no land to call her own, no letter of introduction that might soften a stranger's face when she came asking for work. It was Bishop Aldous Crane who cast her out, citing in flat administrative language a debt her late guardian had allegedly left unpaid to the church's benevolent fund, a sum recorded in a ledger she never saw drawn up and never had the chance to dispute. She left the rectory at Millhaven with $11.40 to her name, every coin of it counted twice into a small tin box that had once held her mentor's nails. With that money, in the town of Sparrow Creek, she bought a sealed icehouse at auction for $6.20, a squat stone building nobody else wanted, its door frozen shut with rust and time, its windows boarded since before the war. The men who watched her buy it laughed behind their hands, certain the girl had thrown away the last of her money on a tomb of old ice and rotted wood. They did not know that sealed inside, beneath layers of sawdust and frozen silence, lay letters that would not only save her, but would unmake the very man who had put her out into the cold. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Rose Hartwell. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us in the comments below, because forgotten places, as Adeline would come to learn, are rarely as empty as they seem. Adeline had come into the world in the spring of 1885 in a farmhouse outside Millhaven, a modest township of white clapboard churches and slow brown rivers in the hill country, where Ohio breathed its last before the land began to climb toward Pennsylvania. Her mother died, bringing her into the world, and her father, a quiet man who mended harnesses for the county's farmers, raised her alone until consumption took him too, when she was only 7, leaving her the ward of the Millhaven parish and, more specifically, the ward of a man named Josiah Pruitt, the town's ice cutter and cooper, a widower with no children of his own and hands like weathered oak. It was Josiah who became, in every way that mattered, her family. He was not a demonstrative man, not given to soft words or embraces, but he fed her, clothed her, and most importantly, he taught her. Because Josiah Pruitt believed with the whole of his quiet heart that a person who knew a trade could never truly be poor, no matter what the ledgers said. Every winter, when Millhaven Pond froze thick and blue-black under the January stars, Josiah would take her out before dawn with the other cutters, and there in the bitter cold he taught her the trade that had sustained him since he was a boy himself. The reading of ice, the way you could tell by sound alone, by the particular ring a chisel made striking the surface, whether the ice beneath was 18 inches of solid winter or a treacherous crust over open water. He taught her to walk the pond with a spud bar, testing each step, to mark the grid with a scoring plow pulled by a patient old mare named Belle, the horse's breath fogging white in the black morning air, the runners of the plow hissing a low continuous note as they scored parallel lines deep and true. He taught her the particular music of the ice saw, that long two-man blade with its teeth like a row of small blue moons, and how the sound changed pitch as it bit deeper, from a dry rasp's whisper to a wetter, heavier groan just before a block broke free and rocked in its channel like something newly born. He taught her to set the tongs, to feel through her palms the exact moment a 300-pound block of ice would shift its balance, and to guide it up the wooden ramp into the icehouse, where it would be packed in sawdust to sleep through the coming heat, layer upon layer, until the building itself seemed to hum with cold even in August. And it was Josiah who, on the winter she turned 14, pressed into her hands the tool that would never after leave her side, a short ice pick with a handle of hickory worn smooth and dark by his own grip over 30 years. Its blade no longer than her palm, but tempered by a Cincinnati smith, who Josiah swore could coax a truer edge from steel than any man east of the Mississippi. "Take care of your tools," he told her, running his thumb along the pick's spine, "and they will take care of you long after the hands that made them are gone to dust." She carried it in her apron pocket every day after that, felt its small solid weight against her hip like a second pulse. And when Josiah's cough began to worsen in her 17th year, deepening through 2 winters into something that rattled and would not clear, she nursed him through the long decline with the same patient competence he had taught her to bring to every task, boiling broths, changing linens, sitting with him through nights when the winds screamed around the eaves, until one gray March morning, with the pond outside just beginning to soften at its edges, Josiah Pruitt closed his eyes and did not open them again, and Adeline was alone in the world for the first time, holding his hand until it had gone entirely cold, the ice pick a small hard comfort against her hip even then. The parish, in its charity, allowed her to remain in Josiah's small house for 2 more years, working what odd trade she could find, mending harnesses as her father once had, cutting ice each winter for the few families who still remembered whose apprentice she had been, and it might have continued that way, indefinitely, had Bishop Aldous Crane not arrived in Millhaven in the autumn of Adeline's 19th year, to conduct what he called a full accounting of the parish's benevolent properties. Crane was a tall, dry man with ink-stained fingers and a voice that never rose and never needed to. A man who had built his considerable influence not on the pulpit, but on the ledger book, and who understood, better than any preacher in the county, that a debt recorded in careful handwriting carried more weight than any sermon. He summoned Adeline to the rectory on a cold October afternoon, sat her across a wide oak desk from himself, and informed her, without preamble or apparent regret, that Josiah Pruitt's estate, including the small house she occupied, had been found to carry an outstanding obligation to the parish benevolent fund dating back some 11 years, a debt she had never once heard mentioned while Josiah lived. This obligation, Crane explained, tapping the page with one long finger, must now be settled through forfeiture of the property, as was the church's right under the original charitable deed. Property, Miss Hartwell, Crane said, folding his hands atop the ledger, as though closing a transaction already completed, is not sentiment. It is an entry that must balance, and yours, I am afraid, does not. She asked, quietly, whether she might see the original record of the debt, and Crane told her the ledgers from that period had been consolidated and were no longer available for individual review, though he assured her the figures were sound. He offered her, in what he clearly considered an act of generosity, a relocation sum of $11, the customary allowance the parish extended to displaced wards, and he suggested she might find opportunity further west where towns were still forming, and a young woman of industrious habits could make her own way. Adeline did not argue, she did not weep, and she did not plead, though something in her chest had gone very still and very cold, colder than any pond she had ever walked at dawn. She simply nodded once, rose from her chair, and asked only that she be permitted to collect her few belongings from the house before vacating it by week's end. Crane granted this with the air of a man dismissing a minor clerical matter, and Adeline walked out of the rectory into the thin autumn light with $11 in her tin box and Josiah's ice pick in her apron pocket, and she did not look back at the church spire even once. She spent 3 days settling what small affairs remained to her, selling what furniture would not fit in a single traveling case, and on a Tuesday morning in late October, she boarded a westbound train out of Millhaven with a single valise, a wool coat that had been her father's, and a folded newspaper someone had left on a station bench, in which she had circled, almost without thinking, a small notice for a county property auction in a place called Sparrow Creek, some 200 miles west in the drier country where the hills flattened and the rivers thinned to seasonal trickles. The train carried her first through country she knew, the rolling green pastures and dense hard stands of home, farmhouses, trailing chimney smoke into a sky still soft with the last of autumn's moisture, and she watched it slide past the window with a strange calm settling over her. The calm of a person who has already absorbed the worst blow, and now waits only to see what comes next. As the miles passed, the land began by slow degrees to change beneath her, the deep greens fading to a paler gold, the dense trees thinning into scattered stands of scrub oak and juniper, the air itself seeming to grow thinner and drier where it came through the gap in the window frame, carrying less the smell of wet earth and more the mineral scent of dust and distant stone. By the second day, the country had opened into something closer to prairie, wide and pale under a sky that seemed impossibly large, broken only by the occasional windmill turning slow and creaking against the horizon, and the rhythmic clatter of the rails became, in that emptiness, almost a kind of company, a heartbeat she could set her own thoughts against. She ate sparingly from the small provisions she'd packed, watched the light change from the gold of morning to the long amber slant of afternoon to a dusk that came down purple and vast over land that seemed to hold its breath. And somewhere in that transformation, watching the world grow sparse and honest around her, she felt something in herself grow sparse and honest too. All the softness of grief and injustice burning away like morning fog, leaving only the hard, clear intention to build something, however small, from what little she had left. She stepped off the train at Sparrow Creek on a Thursday morning into a town that seemed to have grown up reluctantly around a single dusty crossroads, a scattering of clapboard buildings, a feed store, a dry goods shop, a saloon with a faded sign, and a small whitewashed church whose bell she could hear tolling the hour as she walked the length of the main street toward the county courthouse steps, where a modest crowd of perhaps 20 men had gathered for the property auction announced in the paper she carried folded in her coat pocket. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Silas Boone with a voice built for carrying across open fields, was working through a short list of foreclosed and abandoned parcels, mostly failed homestead claims, and a defunct blacksmith's lot. And Adeline stood at the back of the crowd in her father's coat, counting the coins in her tin box by feel alone, until Boone called out the final item of the morning. "We got one more here, folks," Boone announced, consulting his sheet with a squint. "The old Callahan Icehouse out past the creek bend, sealed up tight since, must be near 15 years now. Nobody's touched it, county's just wanting it off the books. Building stone, sounds enough far as anybody can tell, though Lord knows what state the inside's in." Somebody snickered from the front of the crowd, and a heavy-set man in a canvas coat called out that he wouldn't pay 2 bits for a box of rotten sawdust and dead mice, drawing a ripple of laughter that Adeline let pass over her without so much as a flicker of expression. Boone opened the bidding low, and when no serious offer came, when the men shuffled and murmured and turned their attention back to their pipes and their gossip, Adeline stepped forward through the crowd, feeling every eye swing toward her, the strange young woman in a man's traveling coat, and said in a clear, steady voice that she would offer $6 for the property as it stood. A silence followed, then another ripple of laughter, and the man in the canvas coat asked, loud enough for the whole square to hear, whether the little lady intended to keep her own ice cream in there, which drew a fresh round of guffaws that Adeline weathered with her chin level and her hand still. Boone, to his credit, simply looked at her a long moment, then called the bid 3 times over, and when no one else moved, he brought his gavel down with a crack that seemed to echo off the courthouse stone. "Sold to the young lady for $6.20 with the transfer fee," Boone declared. And Adeline stepped up to the folding table where the county clerk waited and counted out her payment in exact coin, watching him write her a receipt in careful looping script, received of Miss A. Hartwell the sum of $6.20 for the Callahan Icehouse and adjoining quarter-acre, Sparrow Creek Township, this 14th day of October. She folded the receipt into her tin box beside her remaining $5.20 and walked out past the creek bend to see, for the first time, exactly what she had bought. The ice house stood alone in a stand of cottonwoods gone gold with the season, a squat structure of gray fieldstone, perhaps 20 feet square, its single door a slab of oak gone silver with age and swollen shut in its frame, its 2 small windows boarded over so completely that not a sliver of light escaped. She spent that first afternoon simply walking its perimeter, running her palm along the mortared stone, noting where the roof sagged, but had not yet failed, where a spring not 50 yards distant still ran clear and cold over a bed of round stones. A stroke of fortune she recognized immediately as the very reason old Callahan must have built here in the first place. She made her camp that first night beneath a lean-to of fallen branches, and her own coat stretched over a frame of green willow, and she woke before dawn to the sound of an animal, or so she thought, moving somewhere near the spring, only to find it was an old man, weathered and bent, filling a jug with water and watching her with an unreadable expression from beneath the brim of a hat gone shapeless with age. He introduced himself after a long silence as Ezra Coombs, once a stonemason and now, in his own dry words, mostly a nuisance to anyone who'd have him, and when she explained without embarrassment that she had bought the sealed icehouse and meant to open it, He studied her for a long moment before saying that old Callahan's building had good bones, better than most folks gave it credit for, and that he supposed, having nothing pressing to occupy his days, he might lend a hand for a share of whatever she found worth finding, be it nothing more than a dry place to store his own goods come winter. It was an alliance struck not in warmth but in mutual necessity, the kind that Adeline, raised by a man who valued a firm handshake over a fine speech, understood and trusted immediately. And by the end of that second day, with Ezra's help, she had rigged a canvas shelter against the icehouse's leeward wall, sturdy enough to keep off the coming frost, and secured her water from the spring in a chain of tin pails, and eaten her first hot meal in 4 days, a thin stew of rabbit Ezra had snared and wild onions she had dug herself, over a fire that crackled low and orange against the deepening cottonwood dark. The door itself took the better part of 2 full days to open, and Adeline approached the task the way Josiah had taught her to approach any stubborn piece of ice, not with brute force but with patient, escalating leverage. She began by clearing 15 years of drifted soil and leaf litter from the base of the frame with a flat spade, working in narrow sections so as not to disturb the foundation stones, and found beneath it that the door's iron hinges had rusted nearly solid, weeping long orange stains down the gray stone. She and Ezra spent the better part of a morning working penetrating oil, a mixture of kerosene and rendered fat Ezra swore by, into every visible joint of those hinges, letting it sit and soak and reapplying it through the afternoon, while Adeline in the meantime addressed the door's swollen wood with a draw knife, shaving thin curls from the edges where it had expanded tight against the frame, testing the gap with her fingers after each pass the way Josiah had taught her to test ice with a spud bar, by feel more than by eye. By the second morning, the hinges had loosened enough to groan rather than seize entirely, when Ezra worked a pry bar beneath the door's base, and Adeline leaned her full weight against a second bar, wedged at the latch side, and between them, with a sound like a long exhale finally released after 15 years of held breath, the door swung outward in a shower of rust flakes and dry rot, and cold, mineral-smelling darkness rolled out to meet them. What greeted her inside was not the ruin the men in town had mocked, but something closer to a tomb, undisturbed, silent, the interior packed floor to rafter with sawdust gone black and dense with age, still faintly damp in its lowest layers, still faintly cold, as though some memory of ice persisted in that stone even after a decade and a half of empty seasons. She and Ezra worked for the better part of 3 more days simply excavating the sawdust, filling burlap sacks, and hauling them out by wheelbarrow to spread as mulch around the cottonwoods, working in careful horizontal layers rather than tunneling blindly, because Adeline understood from years of packing ice herself that a well-built ice house held its contents in orderly courses, and that whatever Callahan might have hidden here would most likely rest not at random, but at some deliberate depth or corner, placed with the same intention any ice cutter brought to his work. It was on the afternoon of the 3rd day of digging, with her palms blistered raw beneath her gloves and her back aching in the particular deep way that comes only from honest labor, that her spade struck something that did not yield the soft resistance of packed sawdust, but instead rang with a small, hollow, unmistakable note. The sound, she realized with her pulse suddenly loud in her ears, of wood striking hollow wood. She and Ezra cleared the space by hand after that, working with their fingers and small trowels rather than spades, uncovering by slow degrees the outline of a low wooden chest set into a shallow pit dug beneath the icehouse's original floor, its lid reinforced with iron strapping gone to soft orange rust, its wood swollen and dark with old damp but remarkably, almost improbably, intact, protected all those years by the very cold and dryness the icehouse had been built to hold. It took the whole of the following morning to free the chest fully from its pit, and to work the rusted hasp loose, Adeline finally resorting to Josiah's small ice pick, sliding its narrow blade into the seam of the lock, and working it with the same patient, rocking pressure she had once used to free stubborn ice from a channel, until with a soft grinding groan the hasp gave way, and the lid lifted on hinges that shrieked their long disuse into the cold stone room. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that had kept the worst of the damp at bay, lay a modest strongbox of tin, and beneath it, packed flat, a bundle of letters tied with waxed cord, the paper yellowed but legible, along with a slim leather ledger whose cover bore, in faded gilt lettering, nearly worn away, the single word Callahan. The ledger told a story that took Adeline the better part of that evening, by lamplight, with Ezra silent and attentive beside the fire, to fully piece together a story that began some 20 years earlier, when Silas Callahan had run not just the ice house, but a modest freight and forwarding business out of Sparrow Creek, moving goods and, on occasion, funds between the small farming communities scattered through that stretch of the territory before the railroad had properly reached them. The ledger recorded, in Callahan's own careful hand, a series of transactions with a young circuit-riding church agent named Aldous Crane, who in those years had traveled the territory, collecting what he called benevolent contributions on behalf of a diocesan relief fund intended to aid struggling homestead families through hard winters. Contributions that, according to Callahan's meticulous notations, Crane had collected in cash from no fewer than 11 separate families across 3 counties. Sums both large and small, entered here with dates, names, and amounts that matched almost precisely. Adeline realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the Cold Stone Room, the very charitable fund whose ledgers Crane had claimed in Millhaven to be unable to produce. The letters beneath the ledger, several dozen of them, were Callahan's own correspondence, drafts, and copies he had apparently kept, along with a handful of anguished replies from families who had never received the relief they'd been promised, families whose crops had failed, whose barns had burned, who had given what little they had to a young persuasive church agent and received nothing in return but a receipt and a blessing. The final letter in the bundle, dated some months before the ice house had apparently been sealed and abandoned, was addressed to Callahan from a woman named Margaret Voss, whose husband had died that winter of exposure after their relief funds never arrived, and it stated plainly, in handwriting grown shaky with grief, her belief that the young Mr. Crane had never forwarded a single dollar to the diocese at all, but had instead, in the chaos and distance of the territory, quietly kept the accounts entirely his own, building on those stolen foundations, the very reputation for financial rectitude that had, Adeline now understood with terrible clarity, carried him all the way to a bishop's chair and to the desk in Millhaven, where he had coldly informed her that property was not sentiment, but an entry that must balance. Tucked into the ledger's final pages, in a hand grown weaker with what must have been Callahan's own final illness, was a note explaining that he had sealed the ice house and the evidence within it, intending to bring the matter before the territorial authorities once he had gathered sufficient corroboration, but that his health had failed him before he could act, and that he entrusted whoever might one day find this record to see that justice, in whatever quiet form it might take, was finally done. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Sparrow Creek, and within a week of the chest's discovery, rumor of buried treasure at the old Callahan place had reached every porch and counter from the courthouse to the feed store, embellished with each retelling until some versions had Adeline unearthing gold bars and others a dead man's bones. A distant Callahan cousin, a thin, sharp-eyed man named Purdy Callahan, who had shown no interest whatsoever in the property when it stood empty and unclaimed for 15 years, arrived on the afternoon stage to assert a family claim to whatever had been found, and the county recorder, uncertain of the legal footing, suggested Adeline, might do well to bring the whole matter before a circuit judge to settle ownership once and for all. It would have been the obvious path, the path any wronged party might reasonably take, laying the ledger and the letters before a court, letting the full record of Aldous Crane's theft and Margaret Voss's grief be read aloud into the official record, watching the bishop's careful reputation crumble in public view exactly as her own security had been dismantled by his hand. Adeline considered it for the better part of 2 long evenings by the fire, turning the ledger over in her lap, running her thumb along its worn cover, and found, in the end, that the idea brought her no satisfaction at all, only a weariness that felt uncomfortably close to becoming the very thing that had been done to her, a person reduced to an entry in someone else's accounting of wrongs. She told Ezra, and later Purdy Callahan himself, that she had no intention of dragging the matter before any court or newspaper, that the strong box and its modest sum of preserved currency, some $400 in old coin and territorial scrip, rightfully belonged first to restitution and not to spectacle, and that she meant to see it returned, quietly and without ceremony, to the families the ledger named, or to their surviving descendants, wherever they could be traced. Purdy Callahan, finding no gold and no easy inheritance, but only a dead man's careful record of another man's crime, lost interest within the week and returned east on the same stage that had brought him. Over the following 2 months, Adeline undertook what she came to think of privately as Josiah's own kind of work, patient, exacting, unglamorous, tracing through county records and church registries the 11 families Callahan's ledger had named. Finding some had moved on entirely, their trail gone cold, but finding others still within a day or two's travel, farming the same hard ground their fathers had worked, and to each of these she brought, without explanation of its origin beyond a vague and truthful account of an old debt finally settled, a portion of the recovered sum, along with, where it seemed right, small practical gifts drawn from her own skill, a set of tools repaired, a well she helped Ezra, and a hired hand deepen and clear. To Margaret Voss's surviving daughter, now a woman grown with children of her own on a modest farm 2 counties distant, she brought not only the largest single portion of the restitution, but also the letters themselves, copied in her own hand, so the family might keep the truth of what had happened to their father, without Adeline needing to surrender Callahan's original testimony, and she watched the woman read her mother's own grieving words after 20 years, and weep at last tears that Adeline herself had never permitted her own eyes since the day Josiah died. As for Aldous Crane, Adeline never wrote him a single word, never sent so much as a receipt or a warning, but word travels along the same quiet channels whether a person intends it to or not, and within the year, whispers began circulating through diocesan circles about irregularities in old benevolent fund accountings from Crane's early circ years. Whispers that grew, as whispers will, into a formal internal review, and by the following autumn Bishop Aldous Crane had been quietly relieved of his post and reassigned to a modest, distant parish where no one troubled to ask why a man of such careful financial reputation had been so abruptly and unceremoniously moved. He never learned, so far as Adeline ever heard, precisely whose hand had set that erosion in motion, and she found she preferred it that way, her justice done in the same silent, administrative shadows in which his cruelty had first been dealt. The ice house itself, meanwhile, became something Adeline had not fully anticipated when she counted out her $6.20 on that October morning. It became a beginning around which a small community began, almost of its own accord, to gather. She restored it properly that first winter, working alongside Ezra to repack it with clean sawdust and freshly cut ice from a bend in Sparrow Creek itself, and by spring she was supplying cold storage to half the farms and the single struggling butcher shop in town, work she understood in her hands and bones as thoroughly as she understood her own name, Old Mrs. Pruitt. No relation to Josiah, only a coincidence of name that made Adeline smile the first time she heard it brought her a basket of dried apples and a quilt when the first hard frost came, refusing any payment, saying only that a girl who worked as hard as Adeline ought to have something warm at night. When Ezra's own roof began to fail that same winter, Adeline spent 3 evenings after her own work was done, helping him reset the shingles, working by lantern light with the same patient hands Josiah had trained, refusing his awkward attempts at payment just as firmly as Mrs. Pruitt had refused hers. She mended a gate for the widow Fenwick down the road in exchange for nothing more than fresh eggs each week. And when the town's small church, a humble whitewashed building with no connection at all to the diocese that had cast her out, needed its bell tower shored up after a spring storm loosened its footing, Adeline was among the first to volunteer her labor, working alongside men who had once laughed at her from the auction crowd, and now simply called her by name, Miss Hartwell, or more often, as the months wore on and her place in Sparrow Creek settled into something solid and unquestioned, simply Adeline. She stood, on a clear cold morning, nearly a year to the day after she had first walked out past the creek bend to see what she had bought, in the open doorway of the ice house, her hand resting against the old oak frame that had once been swollen so tight against 15 years of silence, and felt the familiar cold breath of the interior against her face. The good, clean cold of packed ice and clean sawdust rather than the dead cold of long abandonment. In her apron pocket, worn smooth now against her own hip the way it had once been worn smooth against Josiah's, sat the small ice pick, its hickory handle darker still with a second decade of steady use, and she drew it out and turned it once in the morning light, remembering his voice. Take care of your tools, and they will take care of you long after the hands that made them are gone to dust. And understanding now, in a way she could not have when she was 14 and merely grateful, how thoroughly that small blade had done exactly that, prying open not just a stubborn lock, but an entire buried truth, restoring not just her own fortune, but the quiet dignity of families who had waited 20 years without knowing anyone was coming for them at all. She thought of Millhaven only rarely now, and without bitterness, the way one thinks of weather long past. And when she did think of it, it was mostly to measure the distance she had traveled, not in miles, but in the steadiness that had grown in her like the slow, patient rings of a well-cut tree. It was, she thought, standing there with the cold at her back, and the whole bright ordinary business of a working morning stretched ahead of her, the best $6.20 she ever spent. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Adeline Rose Hartwell. If her story moved you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need to hear it today, and we'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like and subscribe so more stories like this one can find their way to you. Before you go, we'd love to ask you something. What have you found value in that others had already written off? A person, a place, a piece of yourself? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. Until next time, take care of one another and take care of your tools, because you never know what quiet truths they might be waiting to help you uncover.